All right, I am showing 7 p.m. So we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining me on this beautiful Wednesday evening in Vermont. Spring is here, and it seems like it's almost really here. Looking forward to that. Today we're doing a lecture titled "Salt of the Earth: The Rhetoric of White Supremacy," which is about a forthcoming book project that I am writing. And we're also doing a Q&A on Man on Fire, a film that I produced in 2016 that aired on PBS in 2018 and won various awards, including an International Documentary Association Award. So the way that this will be set up is we'll do about 30 minutes of sort of a lecture from the book, and then we'll do a Q&A here at the end. Feel free to just leave comments over on the side, and I should be able to read all of those throughout. So that's sort of our setup. Before we begin, we would like to thank our sponsors. Along with the Vermont Humanities, I would like to thank the Vermont Department of Libraries and the Institute of Museum and Library Services for sponsoring the first Wednesday series of public lectures. This is one of those lectures. Thanks to the Middlebury College Engaged Listening Project and the Mellon Foundation for sponsoring this talk in particular. We'd also like to thank Tapia and Huckabee PC for sponsoring First Wednesday's talks during the 2019 and 2020 season. So thank you for joining us tonight. On June 23rd, 2014, Charles Moore, an elderly white minister, awoke from his home in Allen, Texas, which is a little bit north of Dallas, and drove about 90 miles east to his hometown of Grand Saline, Texas. He left about 8 a.m. or so and arrived in Grand Saline a little after 10 a.m. And then he set out in his car and paced back and forth in this parking lot in the middle of town for about 7 hours or so. So he was there from 10 a.m. till about 5 p.m., pacing back and forth, sometimes going back into his car and sitting for a bit. Around 5 p.m., he took a car cushion from his, or a couch cushion from his car. He went out towards the highway, knelt down on the car cushion, doused himself in gasoline, and lit himself on fire. He left a note on his car windshield titled, "Oh, Grand Saline, repent of your racism." And in this note, he asked the town, or he acknowledged growing up in town in the 1940s and 50s and remembered all this racism. And he believed that the town had never moved past this racism. So he asked the town in 2014 to become more progressive, to attempt to do more integration. The town, Grand Saline, has only 3,300 people or so, and they have no black people that live in town. On the census, at least in 2010, I think it said there was about 24 or so black people living in town. I think some were mixed race, but if you go to Grand Saline, you're not going to see any black people living in town. So he was saying that the racism that he grew up with in the 1940s and 50s was still very prevalent in 2014 when he chose to end his life. And he was attempting to get Grand Saline to change their ways. I heard about this almost immediately because I grew up in Grand Saline. Grand Saline is my hometown too. I was at TCU in Fort Worth, which is about 2.5 hours from Grand Saline, working on my comprehensive exams for my dissertation right when Charles Moore did this act. So I learned about it within 20 minutes, and I was sort of stunned. I was already interested in protest and rhetoric, and we'll talk about maybe what that is in a bit, and race and racism because of my hometown and where I grew up. And I was fascinated with this project. So I was very fortunate to join on the film that hopefully many of you watched, Man on Fire, as the lead producer, and then eventually write this book, which hopefully will be either coming out this year or in 2021. So this racism that Charles Moore spoke about in his letter, "O Grand Saline, Repent of Your Racism," is a racism that I knew very well. My nickname in high school, I'm a quarter Latino. My mom is white. My dad is half Mexican-American. Growing up in Grand Saline with the last name Sanchez, in Texas, Sanchez is what you would say. I was, my nicknames, it was very common to be called Beaner and Wetback for people in high school. This racism was ever present in my hometown experience from middle school when I started in Grand Saline in 7th grade until I graduated in 2006. But it wasn't just racism done into me. There was this sort of systemic, oh no. It just said it stopped. Is it still working? It says, sorry, we're having trouble playing this video. No. If anyone in the comments, is it stop? Did it stop? Oh, it's still going. Okay, I can't see myself anymore. Okay, thank you. That's very weird. If it does go away, please comment over here. Technology, we're dealing with it, right? So it wasn't just even this individual racism that we're talking about. It was also very systemic in nature as well. So for instance, the towns in 9th grade and 10th grade at least, I don't believe I remember this in my junior and senior years. One of the football team slogans was, "We're all right because we're all white." That was something that was said verbatim by the football team, often in spaces where other people could hear it. After I left Grand Saline, I was really upset with my hometown experience, and it wasn't because racism was being done. Kids are always going to be kids, and they're always going to do stupid things. My issue was that there were so many adults, so many people who could have said something and said nothing. And what if other people, other brown or black people, are to come up through town? Is anything ever going to change in Grand Saline? Probably not, unless someone tries to do something. So I harbored a lot of anger towards Grand Saline for a very long time for this. And because, like I said, these sort of sayings and slogans, it was said in front of coaches, in front of teachers, in front of people who had kids. No one ever said anything. No one ever told us that racism was wrong. So what this book project does is Salt of the Earth, the Rhetoric of White Supremacy. It's born from my dissertation, and it's also born from the film that you watch. So the film Man on Fire is about Charles Moore's last day. It chronicles from him waking up to the morning, from him self-immolating, and then it goes through and tries to interview people in the town and tries to figure out, well, where does this racist history, what's really the truth here? Or why do they have this real racist perception problem? So that's what the film attempts to do. The book, on the other hand, it takes a lot of the film, but it does a lot more of this sort of rhetorical work. It argues that we can't have these explicit discourses of racism. We can't have people explicitly expressing white supremacy unless it's built upon these sort of implicit practices that exist. And that's what I'm arguing, not really about, it's taking this microcosm, it's arguing about Grand Saline and showing this white supremacist problem, but it's not saying necessarily that Grand Saline is unique. It is unique in some ways that I'll get into in a moment, but it's not very unique as far as being more white supremacist or more racist than any other town around. That wouldn't be a fair argument to say at all. So by looking at Charles Moore's death and how the people dealt with this, reflecting on my own hometown and doing this sort of autoethnography work, doing upwards of 70 interviews for the film and the book project, I sort of label 3 rhetorical moves that I believe are the biggest issues surrounding this implicit white supremacist discourse and how it builds explicit racism in Grand Saline today. Specifically, I'm looking at how identity is sort of created via assimilation models, where it's asking brown people in particular to assimilate into whiteness sometimes. But there are also many times where white people tell brown people, you're not really part of us. It's also thinking about how storytelling opens up discourses of racism as well, how it allows for white supremacy to live throughout these sort of old stories of what took place here in Grand Saline decades or maybe a century ago or stuff like that. They have these sort of histories and stories that sort of constitute themselves as white supremacists. Also, we're going to be looking at the way that silencing acts as a way to stop any dissenters. Anytime conversations about race or racism pop up in the town, many gatekeepers in the community try to silence those who want to talk about this discourse. We don't need to talk about it. That's just part of the past. It's not a big deal for today. And so that's what we're going to be looking at here today. So I want to focus first on this idea of assimilation and where this comes from in terms of identity. I fit just my own race is sort of interesting in its own right, in that I'm a sort of a 3/4 white kid and pretty much a brown body. I'm white, but I'm not as white as everyone else. And when the last name's Sanchez, you don't really pass as white. Then again, I was raised in a house. I didn't know Spanish. I didn't learn Spanish. I took Spanish classes, but unfortunately, I never tried to learn it. That's a whole nother story of me being lazy in high school and college. And so I didn't really fit in with other Mexican-American or Latinx students at the school as well. And for me as a kid, I don't think I ever explicitly thought about, hey, where do I fit? Am I white? Am I brown? Where do I go to? It was more of, I understood there was power in whiteness. I was very much wanting to understand what other, I understood that white people had all the power in Grand Saline. All the cool kids were quote unquote white, right? All the sports athletes who were the best were typically white. And so I knew that there's power of whiteness that I wanted to assimilate into. I remember one particular story in high school where it's so weird, but in Grand Saline, there's no black people. For the most part, parents, a lot of parents, and I'm sure there's still parents there today, would not allow their kids to date black kids from neighboring towns. I know that existed when I was there in 2016, and I actually still know that exists as of 2006, and I still know that exists as of 2016 or 2017 because I knew of a person who reached out to me because she was kicked out of her house for having a kid with a black man, and her family sort of disowned her for that. So it's still very much present there today. So one time I remember in high school, I went over to a girlfriend's house at the time. We were sitting down for dinner with her and her brother, and her mom leaves to go, I think, get dessert. And her dad leans into me, and I think I just remember, I feel like any brown person from anywhere around the world or any black person has heard this same story before. And here I am in 10th grade or so, first hearing this story. This white dad leaned in and he goes, where are you from? And I said, well, My dad grew up in Tyler. His family's from there. My mom's family is sort of from all around. They lived in various parts of Texas and in Louisiana a little bit as well. And he did that little rhetorical move of, yeah, but where are you really from? You know, being a 15, 16-year-old kid, it took me a minute to fully realize what that question really meant. I didn't understand he was trying to ask me about where my Mexican-American side of family came from. And further than that, once I said that my grandfather on my dad's side had immigrated from Mexico, the biggest question, of course, for many white folks are, well, did he do it legally or not, right? Probably more of the emphasis on, was this illegal or not, right? And I feel like that story just really sort of encapsulates a lot of what this racial entanglement is like for many brown people in Grand Saline. Like I said, black people aren't invited into those houses. They don't have to go through, they don't get to oftentimes date white people within the community. So I was invited in. I was able to in some way assimilate into this whiteness culture where I could date the white girls in the high school as a high school student. But then I still got to ask questions about where my family is really from, right? I highly doubt, had that been a white boy in that area, this dad would have been asking, oh, you know, where from Europe is your family from? Are they from England? Are they from Scotland, Germany? Where? You know, that seemed like a question that was very much loaded around this sort of brownness. So Grand Saline follows, through my interviews and research, it follows this racial hierarchy where we have whiteness is at the top, we have blackness here at the bottom, and we have brownness being in between. So there are times where brown people are very much not aligned with whiteness, where we're, you know, where are you from? You're a beaner, you're a wetback. We can make jokes about your race. That's when I don't align with whiteness. But for instance, when we were in football and we were playing against a team that had black students, now we're a part of the whiteness. Now it's, hey, you more align with us than you do against the black students across on the other side of the field, right? So for brown people in this community, you have to assimilate in and out of whiteness at times. And sometimes you have the agency to do it yourself, but many times you don't have the agency. And it's very much up to certain white gatekeepers at the time to decide where do you fit in any given moment. And I think that's a problem that exists for many people, for many brown people in the community. Perhaps maybe the biggest problem with Grand Saline, though, and so the first chapter of my book really looks at this my individual sort of autoethnography of growing up in the town. In the second chapter, we move, though, to the sort of idea of storytelling. And I want to start off with, in December of 2014, Charles Moore self-immolated in June. By December, an article came out in Texas Monthly titled Man on Fire, and it was written by Michael Hall, who's a terrific writer. Texas Monthly is the biggest statewide publication in the state of Texas. I eventually was able to interview him in I think it was May of 2015. I drove down to Austin, which was about 3 hours south of Fort Worth, and sat down and interviewed Michael Hall. So at this time, I was already studying race in Grand Saline. I already had an understanding of how I felt Grand Saline had this bad reputation from these stories I'll tell you about in a moment. But I interviewed Michael Hall, who'd been across the state. He's written stories all across the state of Texas. And remember, Texas is huge. To get from El Paso, very west Texas, to the Louisiana border is very much a 12-hour drive. He said, after talking with people around the state, people from 10, 12 hours away from Grand Saline, he summarized that Grand Saline was was known as either the most or the second most racist town in the entire state of Texas. And the most racist town, of course, is the one where James Byrd was lynched in the late 1990s, where we had President Obama sign a lynching act with James Byrd's name in it in 2009 or 10. I don't remember the year. And that was in Jasper, Texas. So here's this writer of Austin, 5 hours away from Grand Saline, telling me that Grand Saline, a small town of 3,200 people, has either the most well-known racist reputation or the second most racist reputation behind a town that where people literally lynched someone in the late 1990s. But Grand Saline doesn't have these these truths, these historical records of racism, much like Jasper does. What they rely on is their storytelling tradition. So if you grew up in Grand Saline, I've interviewed 70 people, and in Grand Saline, probably about 35 or 40 people in Grand Saline itself. The rest that we interviewed for the film and the book, some are either Charles Moore's family, or some are people who live in neighboring towns. Every person I interviewed in Grand Saline about the stories could all tell me at least brief parts of 3 specific stories. There's a story of Pole Town, lynchings at Pole Town, stories of the KKK at Clark's Ferry, and stories of Grand Saline being a sundown town. So, growing up in town, I heard all 3 of these stories, very much from the very beginning when I moved into this community. The most haunting of which was of Pole Town, which is a community about maybe 2 miles southwest of Grand Saline. You would cross this old wooden bridge that every time you'd cross it, you would pray to God, please don't let this be the time that I die. You would cross this bridge, and you would go into this community called Pole Town. And the legend went from Grand Saline people that what would happen is back in the day, unspecified, back in the day, people in Pole Town would, if they caught a black person in town, they would take him out and lynch them. They would hang them over this bridge, and they would let the trains come by and sort of demolish their bodies. This is very much a trigger warning, very dark. Demolish their bodies, and that would be a warning to black people on the train, you're not welcome in this community. And then they would eventually, again, trigger warning, this is dark, they would eventually decapitate the heads and put them on poles in the community in Pole Town. And that was where the name Pole Town comes from. And that was a story I very much heard early on in my life in Grand Saline. Years later, when I was working on this film, I interviewed a former mayor of the town. He said that, and there's actually a marker out there, that Pole Town, it didn't really happen like that. The name Pole Town actually comes from, they would build shacks out of these small twigs that they called pole huts. And so the name Pole Town came from that. However, there is at least one recorded incident of a white doctor, Dr. Page, being decapitated and his head put up on a pole in Pole Town. I interviewed the county historian about this, and he was trying to say, oh, it's not racialized. It was a white doctor. They decapitated him, which is already dark within itself. And then I asked, because I knew the story, and I was like, well, why was he killed? And he was like, well, he was killed for helping black people, as a doctor. And he was trying to sort of hide this story of racism, which is pretty ridiculous. So there was that story. There was the story of the KKK at Clark's Ferry. About 7 miles north of Grand Saline was this old turnaround near the Sabine River. You take all these dirt roads to get there. And supposedly the KKK would meet there late at night on the weekends. There are some firsthand accounts of that. In the 1990s, there were multiple people in newspapers saying that they'd been out there at night and had seen actually the Ku Klux Klan out there, even though there is no recorded evidence of that other than some firsthand accounts. And then lastly is Grand Saline is a sundown town. James Lowen, who was at the University of Vermont for a while, I think he's professor emeritus there now, wrote a beautiful book called Sundown Towns. And in it, he labels Grand Saline as a sundown town. And in his research on Grand Saline, he has multiple pieces of anecdotal evidence of Grand Saline being a sundown town. Sundown towns were where you would have signs on the way into town from every entrance saying, don't let the sun set on your black ass, or sometimes they would use the N-word. And what that basically meant is black people aren't welcome here after dark. So moving into town, I heard these stories almost immediately. They were told all the time by high schoolers. I'm not sure if I ever remember hearing them from adults. I do remember hearing it from siblings of some other friends of mine, and my friends also telling these stories. And so Grand Saline cultivates this sort of white supremacy, because all of those stories, if you break it down, all those stories are bad stories of Grand Saline. It doesn't shine a positive light on the community. Yet when kids in this town would tell these stories, it was never, oh, that was bad, we shouldn't have done that. It was always with a smile on their face. Maybe they would play it off as a joke. Oh, we're just joking around about lynching and decapitating black people. Which, where's the joke really there, right? I feel like even if that is a joke, that says more about the identity or the values of the joke teller than it does about the actual history of the town, right? Why do you feel comfortable joking about decapitations? Why do you feel comfortable joking about the KKK or that black people weren't allowed here after dark? So many in the community would say that they're jokes. And again, I argue that that says more about them than it would be if it was the truth. But the biggest thing is that they've existed for at least a century. So in 1909, the Grand Saline Sun newspaper wrote an article talking about a black massacre that happened there at the turn of the 19th century. So in the Reconstruction era, there's a big protest at the salt mine in town, and all of the white people went on strike. So they brought in black people to work at the salt mine. And the editor of the newspaper in 1909 said that a black massacre took place, and in one of the lakes there in town, probably more of a pond, that if you were to take out all the water, the bones of all these black people who were killed there would cover and litter the ground. So that existed in 1909. I talked to the county historian. He says, hey, that was just an editor trying to sell newspapers, which I could get. Sometimes people will pull will pull each other's legs on that. Except that story it was on the front page of the paper, but it was under the fold, right? If you're trying to create a sensational story of, hey, listen to this black massacre, I'm trying to sell newspapers, why wouldn't that be the front page story? That rhetorically it doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, so this existed at least in 1909. It probably existed before that. We're talking in 1909, Grand Saline had this reputation of racism in this black massacre. We fast forward to the 1940s and 50s when Charles Moore was there. He hears the same stories. In his letter, he cites a character or a person he names Uncle Billy, telling him about a lynching that took place at Poletown. And I can't remember, I think it was the early 1950s he mentions that. He also mentions preaching about integration in town in the 1960s and 50s and being kicked out of houses for supporting integration. And then we fast forward to me in the early 2000s, and I hear these same stories. I hear about Poletown. I hear about Cloyce Ferry. I hear about the sundown town. So even it doesn't really matter if these stories are real or not. The history doesn't matter as far as the reputation of Grand Saline is concerned, and more of this storytelling tradition forces white people into this white supremacist ideology. There's no way you can tell those stories over and over, label them as jokes, and not feel differently about the victims of those stories, not feel differently about black people, because you're constantly othering them. You're constantly asserting this violence onto them simply by telling the story over and over and over. A lot of the adults say, hey, that's just something that the kids in town say. I tend to agree that probably is something that's more of a high school thing. Yet it must be something that happened in the high school for decades. It was there when I was there. I've interviewed people in 2016 and 17 about these incidents who had recently graduated from high school. They had known them. Older people know them as well. In some sense, the tradition is telling these stories, and in some ways that builds this sort of ideology of white supremacy. So the last thing I want to talk about here is on this silencing that's taking place. And this is maybe my favorite story to tell. So Charles Moore, it's all these stories are dark, right? Charles Moore self-immolated. on June 23rd, 2014. That was a Monday at 5 p.m. The Grand Saline Sun newspaper comes out on Thursdays. I knew that because when I was working on my master's, I actually worked there for about a year. So I knew a writer who was then the editor when Charles Moore self-immolated. So this takes place. I'm not hearing anything. I hear Charles Moore I hear a man self-immolated. That's all I heard. I didn't hear anything else. So eventually I reach out to the editor on a Wednesday evening, June 25th. And I said, like, hey, I've heard all these stories. I heard there's a letter. What's going on here? I just had this desire to hear the actual story. And so the editor sends it to me, and I read Charles Moore's Grand Saline, Repent of Racism. You can eventually Google that. There's multiple articles where you can read the full article. And so I'm stunned. Here's this white minister who decided to self-immolate to protest racism. This is big news. The editor, before she sent me the letter, she was actually like, hey, please don't scoop me on this. I'm like, look, I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm doing academic work. I'm not scooping. However, I was thinking about turning this into an academic project. So the next day, I called my grandma. I was like, Grandma, please go. She doesn't live in town. I was like, please go pick up one of these newspapers. I need to know how they frame this. I was already thinking, I have this innate desire to write about it, to talk about it. So I want to know how it's talked about in the town. My grandma calls me back later on that afternoon, and she just says, hey, it's not on the front page. It's not here. It's not here. And I'm just stunned. I'm just like, what do you mean it's not here? She's like, it's not on the front page. So on the front page of the Grand Saline Sun was a story about the school board. Big news in Grand Saline, the school board, whatever they were doing, bigger news than a man setting himself on fire, right? Underneath the fold was an article saying, like, man sets himself on fire in parking lot. They don't name Charles Moore, and all they say is that he, quote unquote, he died for, quote unquote, the way that things used to be here, end quote. That pissed me off. I couldn't believe he very much, in this letter, he states his reasons. And I couldn't believe, as an editor, you have this sort of moral obligation to write. Why did he self-immolate? What was he really trying to do? So I call up the editor again, and I'm sort of furious with her. And I'm like, why did you do that? And she laid it to me straight, and I really understand her point. She said that had she named what Charles Moore had done and the exact reasons and named him, that people in the town would have criticized her and called her a race baiter and say, like, oh, you're trying to all bring this up again. You're trying to make this a big issue. And so she felt like the safe space was to not name it, to just say the way that things used to be here, which to people in Grand Saline, that connotes information, right? There was no way you grew up in that town and didn't know what things used to be here meant. That meant the racism of the past. But for outsiders, they wouldn't necessarily know what that means. So I was sort of stunned, and I sort of let into her a little bit. And eventually, I don't know if I had an effect on her. 2 weeks later, she wrote an op-ed sort of saying, hey, Grand Saline needs to deal with their racist history. She didn't quote cite a lot of evidence. She just sort of talked about the stories. And she said people need to deal with this history. A week or 2 weeks later, some prominent citizens in the town write a letter saying that she was wrong, that she should apologize and state their historical truths of the town, some of which are true, many of which are half-truths and so forth. And the editor of the newspaper was let go 2 months later. And I still sometimes feel, I have no idea if I had any influence on her or not, but I still sometimes feel guilty on, did I help her lose her job in some capacity? I don't know. But on the other hand, I really still understand this moral obligation to speak truth to power, right? And that's what an editor of a newspaper should do. So the story really encapsulates this idea of silencing, how that takes place in the town. You're not allowed to talk about racism in the community. I think I remember this from many different sort of perspectives. If you do try to dissent, I try to talk about race a lot as someone who left Grand Saline, and people would say like, "Oh, you're a race baiter. We don't have to trust you. You're just some liberal, yada yada yada." They can never take my point seriously. But you also saw a silencing around Moore's story, and you see it in the newspaper. You see it in that they erased the burn marks from the ground very quickly after he died, within a few days. And I think I totally understand that. I'm not saying that that's some way to dismiss the story. They're trying to cover up a trauma, but no matter what, it still erases his story. Maybe even worse than that is a makeshift memorial was set up in Charles Moore's honor in town a few months later. They tied a note, on a big piece of paper saying "R.I.P. Charles Moore," tied it to a telephone pole or a light pole in the parking lot where he died. And within 2 days, that makeshift memorial was taken down. So Charles Moore's story was silenced in some capacity. Many of the people I interviewed about Charles Moore, the younger people, especially the more liberal people, had very much known why he died. Some of the older people, they couldn't tell you the reason. They would just say he was crazy. He was insane. He wasn't all there. And in many ways, and so that was a way to dismiss whatever it was that, if you're trying to have this conversation about race or racism, we can just dismiss that as labeling you as crazy, right? But there was also self-silencing in there as well. There's many people we tried to interview for the film that I wanted to go in front of the camera. I knew they had things to say, but it felt like if I did do that, what would the town think? When the town watches the film, would they try to kick me out of town? Would they treat me the same? Would they treat me differently? So in that sense, there's even this self-silencing taking place there. Well, people who wanted to speak out felt so uncomfortable, understood the town would despise them so much that they couldn't do it. So in Grand Saline, silencing is also a big rhetorical move. It exists as a way to prevent dissenters from speaking out. And for anyone who does dissent, it labels them as outsiders, as crazy people, as liberals. We don't have to actually foster any real discussion about this. So overall, and typical academic, 736, I'll be finishing up here in just a few moments. Overall, these three big moves, the assimilation model, this hierarchy that exists and how brown people move in and out of whiteness and white supremacy, the storytelling tradition of the town, and the silencing are the three moves that really very much exist on an implicit level, and they build up this explicit racism, and they build up this perception of Grand Saline as a racist society. Like I said before, Grand Saline isn't that unique, and their overall, their white supremacy or their racism, that racism exists everywhere. They're not very unique in that. Where they are unique is in their perception. They don't have many recorded instances of racism taking place. But they have this perception of racism that everyone in towns neighboring them, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 60 miles away, have heard of them. And people across the state have heard of them. And it exists because of those three reasons, because of this silencing. We can never have this true conversation because they force brown people into this sort of model of assimilation towards whiteness or towards blackness whenever the white gatekeepers feel like they need them or don't want them. And because of these stories, especially because of these stories. So I want to end with the same promise that I make in the end of the book. I very much was moved by Charles Moore's act. He was, I never knew Charles Moore. I never heard of him before this took place. But it spoke to me on this very real and very emotional level. And in some ways, our lives sort of intertwined in that moment, right? These two people who care very so much about race. One person who self-immolates, and then I felt like I could pick up the mantle and take it with my research project and with this film. And I sort of made a promise to some of Charles Moore's family and to some of my own friends and colleagues that in the state of Texas, the Texas State Historical Commission doesn't allow you to put up a memorial to someone who's died until 10 years after they died. So my promise that I'm stating here as well is on June 23rd, 2024, I will petition the Texas State Historical Commission to put up a memorial. Probably not going to be within Grand Saline. I doubt the city would allow that, but hopefully at least outside of the city. As that reminder, if Grand Saline wants to keep silencing dissenters, silencing people who want to talk about race, this will force them to listen. This will force them to react to Charles Moore's life and his death and the conversation he wanted to start. Thank you. So it is about 7:40. We have times to open up for questions here. I see that there are some questions about the video. I hope that, oh man, I should have been following the comments. Can we see the video now? Will someone comment? Technology. We have problems. All right, I see the Vermont Humanities Council is typing. I see Laura with 10 clap marks. So I assume that means, I don't know how long I was out for. Dang, I should have been watching the comments. I assume you can still hear me. So it's if you have questions, feel free to start putting them in the comments here. So I do have one question that was asked that I'll sort of do first, and then we'll answer some more. A person writes, do you have a religious faith, and did working on Charles Moore's film and thus this project change my faith at all? Which is a really good question, and I typically don't publicly talk about faith, but I'll do so here. By the time Charles Moore self-immolated, I wasn't very religious. I was raised in a Southern Baptist church. My grandfather was a Southern Baptist preacher who I loved very much, but in Texas, politics and religion go hand in hand, and so by the time 2007, 2008 rolled around, what was happening in the world then, many churches that I'd gone to had gotten very political, and that pissed me off. And so I sort of lost, I moved away from church after that because I have I have a lot of anger towards anyone who stands behind a pulpit and preaches politics. So that's my high horse here. So by the time Charles Moore self-immolated, no, I wasn't that religious. But by the time it ended and by the time I started researching this and going along with it, and I read so many sermons of Charles Moore's. And Charles Moore, he would type out his sermons, and the dude could write. He was a phenomenal writer and a phenomenal preacher. I still remember this one sermon called "You Give Them Something to Eat." And he's talking about the parable where Jesus and the disciples feed the 5,000 with the fish and the bread. And this is Charles Moore preaching in the 1990s. And he's basically talking about how at the end of the day, we have all these platitudes of, oh, my money's my money. It's all about individualism. Why should I have to give to others? Da, 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 da. And Charles Moore was, in the ending of his sermon, he says, at the end of the day, God stands before you and asks you, or tells you, you give them something to eat. And I remember reading that sermon when I was going through some of the archives of Charles Moore, and that touched something within. And so I've become a little bit more religious and spiritual after this act, and I think it for me it took something so extremist and something so bizarre to see someone give up their life for a cause, something they truly believe in, and make me think about what do I believe? Would I ever sacrifice my life for something? And I don't think I would. And that just started getting stuff stirring within. So I think Charles Moore's death really took me to a new place in that regard. I'm going to look at the comments here. heavily tattooed woman shown in the video. She talked very frankly about racism, but she's not identified. Yes, that was that was someone who grew up in Grand Saline. She's a few years older than me. I'm not going to identify her name because I can't. I'm not sure. I feel like she would be comfortable, but I'm just not going to do it. She was probably when I was in 8th grade, she was a senior. So she would have been 4 or 5 years older than me. And she left Grand Saline and moved somewhere else and became sort of this anti-racist. And so she was one of the first few people who, if you watch the film, you'll see that there's a lot of older people in the film and not that many younger people. The reason being that the younger people all knew me, and I was a liberal, race baiter, yada, yada, the works. So most of them wouldn't want to be interviewed in the film. So most of the young people are liberal. And she was one of the few liberal sort of anti-racist young woman who wanted to come forward and speak. And I was very grateful for her. She is an amazing person. And I wish she was here to comment because she would have loved to see your comment rally. Janice writes, what has happened to the young woman with the tattoos? Has she been ostracized? So she doesn't live in the town anymore. She grew up in the town. She moved away right after high school, and she lives in Dallas, an hour and a half west of Grand Saline. So she's doing great. She's a teacher. She's a very lovely person. I don't think she's been ostracized for the town very much at all. But I also feel like, she knows with issues of race, she can't be that very public with it because she knows how the town would react to that. But she did have the courage to come forward to be interviewed, and we're ever grateful for that. Nancy writes, the black minister at the end of the film seems to believe all is well in Grand Saline now. Can you share more about that man and your perceptions? Yes, Nancy, that's a great question. So we interviewed Richard at the end, and he was, so Main Street Baptist Church is the biggest church in Grand Saline, and Richard was the interim pastor there for a year. 2012, 2013, 2014, something along those lines. It was really interesting. One story about him is I heard this. He had actually won Man of the Year there in 2013 or so. And I'd actually had someone message me and be like, look, the town isn't racist. Look, they named a black man the Man of the Year. And I'm like, that's not a sign that you're not racist. Like, what a terrible argument. But we first heard of this so I knew this guy, I knew he'd been there, and I knew that he'd left. And so one night we were filming somewhere, and one of his former parishioners pulls me aside, and this is someone my grandfather had known as well, and said, hey, you know why that guy left, right? And I was like, no. And he's like, he got ran out of town. There was racism. He eventually just got run out of town. And this is someone who is a minister in his own right. He goes around and does like ministry in prisons and so forth. This is a very trustworthy person. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, we need to interview this guy. So I reach out. He was now working at the Southern Baptist Convention in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. So I reach out and we do this interview. And from the very beginning, it was clear that he felt no hatred towards Grand Saline. He felt like there was no racism. He had no problem with them. But the story he shares, that's in the film, shows that, hey, there still is racism in that community, right? I mean, he somewhat acknowledges that with that story. But he only had love for the town. And at the end of the day, I have to step back and I think, which one is telling us the truth? The guy who said he got run out of town, or the person who says, hey, I have love for the town? Of course, I believe that person. I don't think he was lying to us by any means. But it makes me question, why did the story exist that he got run out of town? Who would come up with that? And the reason that I come up with, and this is totally speculation, but I think it fits in with the narrative of the town, is for some people who didn't know why he left, the easiest assumption to make, if you know the reputation and the perception of Grand Saline and why a black minister is no longer preaching in town, is that he must have been ran out of town. He must have been kicked out by the white parishioners. Even if that isn't the truth, for many people who don't know, that's probably an easy narrative to formulate, right? So that's sort of his story. He was a very lovely person, though. And his smile, he has a terrific smile. Every time I watch the film, his smile makes me feel very warm. I'm going to take a drink of water real quick. Daniel writes, any idea why this town has a racist history? One would think in Texas that brown people would be familiar, so why not blacks? I think that if I had to guess, again, speculation here, I would say that there is some truth to the Reconstruction era story. Maybe it wasn't that there was a true black massacre where hundreds died. Maybe it was only a few people. But I believe that there is some truth to that story. And thus, if that's the only story, if that's the only true incident of like explicit, violent racism taking place here, then that created this culture for the town for the rest of for over a century, right? So to me, it's less about, Grand Saline wouldn't be known as racist if they didn't want to keep the perception of them as racist alive, if that makes sense. If they wanted that to end, they could hold a public forum with black people from neighboring towns in a week, and that would start to dissolve that reputation. I've asked people to do that before. They refuse to do it. And so I think that even though they would tell you publicly that they don't like that perception, it hurts them. And many of them, of course, don't like that for many reasons, right? But at the end of the day, I think there's many of them in town who actually do like that perception and are very much okay with them being known as racist, or one of the most racist towns in the state of Texas. Okay. I wonder if enjoyed the presentation. I wonder if the video aspect could be more enlivened without becoming sensational or fake. Judy, I'm confused with what you're asking there. If you might want to ask that again, Judy. I'm confused what you're talking about. The video being enlivened without becoming sensational or fake. Kathy or Philip, I'm going to get to you. Kathy, we do actually have a captioned version DVD, but we didn't have one on digital, and it was something that I wish I should have uploaded. That's totally on me. We do have that version, so that's something that I can work with the Vermont Humanities Council to potentially fix. All right, so I'm going to read Philip's question here. Did you have any moments during your research where you debated whether you should self-silence yourself about what you had learned? You don't have to tell us what it was, but I'm curious if you ever went through an experience similar to people who you saw self-silencing. I have a pretty great story on that, Philip. So Charles Moore died. That I talk about the newspaper. I'm furious. So the newspaper, Grand Saline Sun, comes out on a Thursday. Saturday, I drive home. It's my grandfather's last day preaching. He was at a big church, and then he went to a small church after he retired to just preach again before retiring a second time. And it was his final retirement from preaching. So I went home that weekend, and I talked to him and my mom, and we talked about what was right here, and my family didn't really understand why I was so fascinated with this story at the time, and I didn't know what I should be doing. I felt like I needed to do something, but I also didn't want to become known as the race baiter, as I keep saying. So I went home, I went to church with my family, eventually got done, and I drove back that Sunday evening, and I realized I have to do something. So I emailed 10 newspapers and news stations across the DFW and East Texas area. DFW, that was very Texan accent there. And tried to get his story out in the open. Eventually, a reporter calls me back on that Monday and has some questions for me. And I remember in that moment, I realized I was now, and this was the biggest newspaper in the East Texas area. I knew in that moment, if I went on the record, people in town would know like where I stood on this and that I was okay, referring to this racist problem in the community. So I had to make a choice if that was something I was willing to do or not. And to me, the bigger injustice was not having Moore's voice be heard, right? To not have his truth out in the open. So I did go on the record, I did get some pushback, not too much. The worst pushback I ever got was from never really from any close friends who I lost along the way. Most of them just sort of went silent on me, but it was actually from some of the family of friends on social media. They would say that I've just fabricated everything. This is all me coming up with lies. I'm the one coming like we're all right because we're all white. No one ever said that. I'm just lying about it. And many of them would fabricate these stories that I called their sons, some of my close friends, racist. And that, that's why we're not friends anymore, because I called them racist, which I would never, like publicly just say all my friends from my hometown are racist. But it was, to me, that was just an easy thing to do. It was easy to just be like, oh, we can just dismiss him by saying, hey, his friends are all racist, or he thinks his friends are all racist. That's an easy thing for us to just dismiss him with. But yeah, I've had some of those questions at the beginning. But by the time the filming started, by the time writing the book and so forth, I never have any more questions about that. So we still have some questions here. April, how did you navigate the personal in your research? How this affects you and loved ones personally as a person of color? It was very much. So when this took place, I knew I had to write about this instantly. I thought this might be a chapter in my dissertation. And I remember sometime in July sitting down with my dissertation director and being like, hey, I think this story should be a chapter in this dissertation. And my Brad Lucas, he's a great person, he said, no, this is the entire dissertation. And I was like, oh, that's a lot to write, 250, 300 pages on this one incident, which actually turned out to be, somewhat kind of easy because I cared about it so much. And I think that navigation of the personal that April asked about is how I did navigate it. I think for me, it would have been harder to write about something that I didn't have a personal connection to. But every day I got up to write, or every day when we would go out filming for, we'd leave at 8 a.m., we'd be back at 10 o'clock at night. Those days we'd be hours out and about doing the research, writing the dissertation, all of that. It felt worth it. I knew I was doing something that I felt like was in some ways justice. I was doing something that was important to me. And so I very much wanted the personal to be a part of this project because it affected me personally. Charles Moore changed my life. There's no doubt. A lot of times people ask, has anyone in the town changed because of this? And I say, some people have, some people haven't, but I know that I have. And so to me, it helped me understand why scholarship is important. we often think of what academics write about, and they're in the ivory tower doing the research, and it doesn't connect with the broader public. But I knew it does, right? There's no doubt that it does. And I knew that this just had to be that my story had to be a part of this. It's not a part of the film, but it's very much a part of my dissertation and my own book. After I left Grand Saline, my mom moved away, and then I had no other family who lived there. I had family that lived within 20 miles or so, but no one else who lived there in that moment. So by that time, I felt comfortable that, my family wouldn't get any backlash from this. I don't know if things would have changed had my mom still lived there. It would have been tough. I know my mom would have felt, happy that I still, would write what I feel important is important, but I don't know, that might have changed things. Janice asked, "Did you ask why the black minister left?" Yeah, so he was just an interim pastor. So he never lived in Grand Saline. He still lived in the Fort Worth area. So he would drive 2 to 2.5 hours every Sunday to preach Sunday morning at the church, and then would drive back, I think. Which to me always took as like, that sounds suspect. But he again, it sounds suspect, but and we can all, do our own thoughts of what or think what we have our own thoughts about what we think there. But he never seemed to feel like there was anything nefarious going on. He said, he was actually a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. That's where his heart lied. He loved the town. He said that the town actually wanted him to become the full-time preacher, but he felt a calling to do more work with the Southern Baptist Convention. So that is why he said he left. So we still have 2 more questions here. We're going until 8:30, I believe. So if you have more questions, keep writing them. So Chase says, you said you're committed to memorialize Charles Moore. What would this look like, both literally and rhetorically? How might it change the discourse of white supremacy in Grand Saline? I'm pretty sure with, and I haven't done all my research in this. I have until 2024 to figure it out. So I have a little bit of time. With the memorial, I'm pretty sure the Texas State Historical Commission allows outside researchers to help write some of the memorials they put together. So I think, but I also know that I do a lot of public memory research, so I've seen what sometimes when they get in trouble, what do? And so I know that they won't want to be too political. They won't let it be too much about racism or whatever else. They'll want to sort of whitewash it in some regard. And so I would hope that, so I understand that they're not going to allow this most idealized version of Charles Moore's life be presented. But I hope there's some good middle ground we can work with. Again, I don't know exactly what that will look like yet. But yeah, to me, this will exist as a living reminder in some capacity of what one man did to fight for what he believes is justice in the community, right? This will be something that will exist until the world ends or until the world changes drastically. This memorial will exist in this space telling people that Charles Moore self-immolated here to protest racism. So I don't know if there's going to be a lot of people who don't actively think about it, who don't go out to the marker and memorialize or commemorate Charles Moore's life, of course. That's not going to take place. But maybe it will change a few people. And maybe it'll change future generations. Maybe 20, 30 years from now, people will see a marker there and think, wow, like, how did this town used to be? Why is this still a problem? Maybe we can change it. As of now, I don't think there's anything that could change the discourses of white supremacy in Grand Saline right now. It takes active participation. I think the town knows they have this perception problem. They refuse to deal with it. And until they actively try to deal with it, nothing will change. But I hope a memorial, it may not be able to get them actively wanting to change it in 2024, but maybe it will in 2030, 2034, something like that. So that's ultimately my hope. Okay, Kathy has a question for VHC. All right, so this is the final question I have. So please, more questions if you have them. Oh, not a question. So Hillary says, not her denomination, but in her experience, interim ministers are not allowed to go full-time after their interims. So I did speak to a, oh gosh, I can't remember what they, not a preacher there, but the board at churches. You know what term I'm thinking of. I can't remember it right now. I did speak to one of those people, and they told me that they had actually taken a vote to have this minister go for it. They wanted to make this minister full-time to be their active minister, and that he ultimately turned them down. So the church's board had asked this minister to be their full-time minister, and he ultimately said no. So that was his decision. Again, he claims that racism really wasn't the problem here, that it was very much more of a his heart was in the bigger convention. I think that in some sense we had to take him at his word. And in my, I feel like I interviewed lots of people in this project, and I feel like I have a good gut for when there are times when I felt like someone is actively lying to me. I just knew someone was lying to me. But with him, I never felt like he was lying to me. I felt like he was telling me the truth. Could he have been a good liar? Maybe, but I don't feel like he was lying. All right, I see two more questions came in. From Jackie. Charles Moore was also concerned with justice for LGBTQ people. Yes. What is the culture climate in Grand Saline regarding these folks and issues? It's a really good question. So before we answer Grand Saline, let me just talk about Charles Moore's activism for those issues. So in the mid-'90s, Charles Moore had a church in Austin, Texas, and he went on I can't remember how many days. I'm thinking it was somewhere around 15 or 17 day hunger strike. Didn't eat any food for 15 or 17 days to petition the United Methodist Church, who was holding their national conference in Austin at the time. And it was petitioning them to change their stance on homosexuality within the church. And he actually succeeded. Now, they didn't take a progressive stance in the mid-'90s, but they went from a very negative stance of we don't really want anything to do with these people to a stance of everyone is loved in front of the eyes of God or something along those ways, which, it's not a drastic change, but it's an important change. So that was my first recollection of Charles Moore fighting for LGBTQ people. There is, and this complicates things in some degree, but he did think about self-immolating 2 days prior on June 21st, which would have been the 50th anniversary of the Philadelphia, Mississippi 3 who were murdered during Freedom Summer. He did think about self-immolating on Southern Methodist University's campus to protest their stance on LGBTQ people. But he couldn't go through with it. And a lot of people speculate, and I agree with this, that it was because at the end of the day, he went to SMU for his to get his degree in ministry, and he still loved that campus. So Charles he fought for a lot of issues throughout his life. LGBTQ people, he fought for race and racism. In the 1960s, he moved his family to Chicago to fight for civil rights. He went to India to fight for to spread Christianity there for a few years. Charles Moore was an activist, without doubt. To me, let me finish answering that question. I guess it's just, I don't know too much about that culture there. I know that there are some people who are openly LGBTQ, and it doesn't seem to have the same bigotry as maybe, what some people in the town think about black people. But again, that would be speculation on my part. I'm not sure if I can go too much into that. But I will just say for Charles Moore, I think, he cared so much about these issues, but it's interesting that he couldn't do it on SMU's campus, and he couldn't do it for these gay and lesbian rights. And ultimately, it came back to his hometown. It came back to these issues that he was dealing with in the 1940s and 50s of racism. And that's ultimately what led him to self-immolate. And so, yeah, that sort of answers your question. Which of the interviews was the hardest to conduct? Whew. It's a good question. Who was the hardest to conduct? I take hardest in two different ways. Hardest as far as hardest as far as it affecting me was Buddy, who's in the white tank top, who describes Charles Moore's death. And we had to, in some ways, lighten down that conversation because David Halberstrom is a famous American writer who was at Thich Quang Duc's self-immolation in Saigon in 1963. And he went into full detail about seeing Thich Quang Duc self-immolate. And we all have seen that popular image. And to me, what I found is when you see someone self-immolate, that's stamped in your brain. That image doesn't leave. And so Buddy, who's in the white tank top, was able to go into full detail. And at one point, we almost had to stop because it was so just, I had such a visceral reaction to hearing what he saw and the nightmares he had about this. The hardest, so in some sense, that was the hardest. The hardest, and I think more getting to your question as far as maybe the hardest as far as maybe the racial aspect is concerned. I don't know if there was anyone that we had to really press too hard. Most of them came across, once you got the camera rolling, they came across pretty easily. I don't even think there was any that was hard from a racist perspective. It was more of the familial side. So interviewing Charles Moore's stepdaughter and stepson-in-law, that was hard. You write about someone, you have these ideas about what you think about someone, and then you realize you're putting a camera into someone's life and you're telling us, hey, tell us how this affected you. That's a hard thing to do. And his son was also, because his son had a very complicated relationship with him. So that was also a very tough one. I see another question here. So, more questions if you have them. Daniel Gottlieb asks, do you have any thoughts for your next project? I assume you mean film project. Yes, I can't go into full detail. Probably filmed maybe half to 2/3 of it. It is going to be about an elite New England boarding school who has covered up sexual assault and rape for decades and are just now dealing with the repercussions of that after a report came out. So we're dealing with speaking with a lot of the survivors of these assaults and seeing how did they deal with that, speaking with some of the school administrators, speaking with some lawyers dealing with this, and then hopefully speaking with some of these predators as well. And so what that project is really going to be trying to do, and the associate producer, Laura, is the one who just sounds like an awesome project. She's a producer on that. So I'm calling her out. So what we're trying to do there is to better understand the institutional sort of systemic nature of cover-up, especially at boarding schools, because here's going to be a little rant. Your number one obligation is the protection of your students. But I'm so surprised at how many times administrators take the perception of themselves or their teachers or the institute itself. They weigh that over protecting their students, protecting kids, protecting teenagers. So that project is going to be looking at these sort of mechanisms of why these sort of institutes go that route. That's sort of the final question I see here. Some more questions if we have time. We have 12 more minutes or so if anyone else has a question. I do have one in my that someone had written beforehand that I'll answer, and then I'll see if anyone else wrote anything. Do you know if Moore had connections to the African-American community in the area, especially people in the church that we sort of interviewed? If he doesn't have any connections, does that say anything? What does that say? So Charles Moore, after he left Grand Saline in the 50s, he never lived in town again on his own. His mother had a house there until she died. And after she died, he still had that house there. So sometimes he would take trips there. He would maybe stay for a week in there, something like that. But he never lived back there again. So many people, that he even went to school with, he kept in touch with some people, but many of them said that they hadn't heard of him, in years. So he didn't have really any connection with the African American communities, Black communities in other towns, in neighboring towns, because he didn't really have any connections in Grand Saline. So oftentimes people will take that as a way to say that, well, Charles Moore knew nothing about the town. He was dealing with something that he saw in the 1950s. Here we are 60-something years later. How does he really know the culture of the town? Well, he did extensive research. In his archives, he took meticulous notes. He had interviewed historians and oral historians around the state of Texas. Anytime there were articles about race in Grand Saline coming out, he had them. He had a folder just of these things that it was clear he'd kept for years, because he would have clippings from newspapers that came out in the 1980s talking about race in Grand Saline, especially one about a desegregation housing project in town that he'd had, and he'd cut out from a newspaper. I don't see why he would have found that newspaper in the present and cut it out, from the 1980s, right? So this is, to me, that said that this had been something that had been affecting Moore for a very long time. This was something he couldn't get past. And that's something that his son Guy says in the film, that he loved Grand Saline in some sense, but he also had this legacy of racism lingering. And even though he loved the town, he couldn't live with that problem that he had seen decades earlier. And from doing his research, he came to the conclusion that nothing had changed in Grand Saline, and rightfully so. So he didn't have any connections with really that many people in the town or in neighboring communities. And in some sense, that seems misguided, and it's totally fine to feel that what Charles Moore did was misguided. That is a fine assertion to make, but it also, in some sense, gives it more weight. Right? It makes it weightier that this man would choose to die for a community he hasn't lived in for over 60 years. And would choose to die to protest racism, and he doesn't even fully know, the racism, if the racism is still, how active is the racism in the town? And to me, that carries a lot of weight. So I think you can see that as a two-sided coin there. But ultimately, I think Charles Moore's death, it's easy to say he was crazy or he was out of his mind or something like that. That's an easy excuse. And I just want to say, I hate that because I don't like people speculating about someone's mental health when they're not mental health experts. But I would say also that, there's nothing, if you read all of his notes, this sounds like someone who knew exactly what he wanted to do. And I think we have to take that seriously. All right, I see another question here. Are you working with Joel, the same director, on your new project? And do you think you'll get a bookshelf for all this bus on the floor? What's the royalties from your book and film have come in? The royalties for the film have come in, my friend. Actually, my girlfriend and I are moving soon. So a lot of this is down because we're moving in the middle of a pandemic. Smartest time to move, by the way. And yes, I am working with Joel. Joel will be the director on that film project, or Joel is the director on that film project. And we're excited about that project. We're excited to show you all and to show audiences what we capture, because it's also a very important conversation. So I have us at 8:21. I'll maybe see just one more minute. If no questions come up, we'll end it. I was going to just go into an ending, but I don't know if. Let's give one moment. I'll just sit here for a second. It's kind of awkward. I'll take a drink out of the water. All right, well, we'll start wrapping up. If I see something, I'll answer it quick. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it. I know I speak for myself and the Vermont Humanities Council. We appreciate you joining us on a Wednesday night. Also, it's in the middle of a pandemic. What else do you have going on? So you can join us. We truly appreciate it. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out on Facebook, on social media, on Twitter. You can email me through my Middlebury address. And thank you so much for joining us, and keep up with the rest of the Vermont Humanities Council Wednesday projects, because they're all phenomenal. So have a good evening, everyone. Bye.